For those of us who live in tropical and subtropical Pacific Islands, the ancient plants of Pacific Islanders are all around us, and all we have to do is kind of look in yards and in fields and in the store, and we can pick out those plants that were domesticated a very long time ago in the Western Pacific and then distributed throughout the Eastern Pacific as far as Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa. Agricultural societies are frequently typified by their dependence upon certain kinds of crops. Crop plant species that are the most important in a particular culture are under heavy selection pressure with many recognized varieties. In general, the more important the crop is, the more varieties that will be named and recognized and used within a particular society. Pacific communities have excelled in developing tree and root crops and have actually underemphasized the production of grains and legumes as are found in most other parts of the world. When we consider the development of Pacific crops, we can look at three large categories of activity. The first is pre-agricultural wild harvested foods. These include nuts and fruits from lowland forest trees primarily, roots that come out of swamps, and lowland forest vines that can be used. And they include starch from swamp palm species, such as sago palms. We next move into an early agricultural phase, and this is agriculture as practiced by non-stratified societies. This includes arboriculture, or the growing of trees for their nuts and fruits, and a minimal amount of storage of the results of this, so storing some nuts and storing some processed fruits. This includes scattered swamp horticulture and selection of varieties, looking for better types and minor local differences, and selected planting of ones that appear to be a little bit better than others. The third category typifies most of what has occurred across the Pacific Islands, and really most of what we can see if we are to visit other Pacific Island communities. And this is agriculture within a stratified society. This is focused on primarily swamp agriculture. It involves storage of some kinds of foods, but oftentimes the food is stored by just not harvesting it, allowing it to stay in the field and continue to get bigger. There's a fair amount of surplus that's produced in these kinds of systems. This is part of what accounts for the stratified system of the society. And there's a lot of selection that takes place, where people are actively and aggressively looking for better varieties, improvements in the crops, and are actively planting those and moving away from lesser crops. Within this third category, there's really only a supporting role for arboriculture, the one exception being that in some atoll systems, breadfruit, which is an arboriculture crop, takes on a high status, but this is kind of unusual and is not terribly typical. There's a number of coastal forest trees and shrubs that have been important and have been both moved around the Pacific Islands and have been sought out as people move to new islands. It's rather confusing to determine if these are plants that are entirely naturally distributed, or if they're partially distributed by humans, or if they're entirely distributed by humans. Arguments have waged in all three of those directions. This list shows ones that made it to Hawaii. These ones are listed with the name in bold. Ones that did not make it to Hawaii, but also have a Polynesian name, are listed in parentheses, with the name listed being a Samoan name for that plant. This next list illustrates the set of lowland forest trees. These tend to be bigger than the trees in the prior list, and they tend to be found outside of the coastal strand at a little bit higher altitude, or at least inland away from the ocean. You notice that none of these trees that are listed were brought as far as Hawaii, and therefore I've listed Samoan names for each of these. The third category of trees that we see are those that are semi-domesticated. These include trees that came into Polynesia and therefore are listed with a Polynesian name, and one example of a tree that didn't even make it into Polynesia. It never left Melanesia. This was the Canarium. Semi-domesticated trees are those that are fertile but don't happen to have varieties that are recognized. So there's really just one species, one kind of these. Domesticated trees are those that are fertile and have recognized varieties. We consider them to be domesticated because people are actively planting them and are actively selecting from amongst the plants that they've planted. And you notice that on this list, several of these made it as far as Hawaii, indicating that although we didn't see any of the semi-domesticates making it to ancient Hawaii, we do see the domesticated trees coming as far as Hawaii. Finally, we have one special case of a domesticated tree, which is, for the most part, largely sterile and happens to have many varieties. This is breadfruit, or ulu. What's interesting is that this tree, although it has many varieties, particularly in areas such as the Marquesas, in Hawaii it was only noted to have one variety in the past. And this is actually highly unusual, and it represents a mystery that nobody's been able to understand. Next category we have is kind of other domesticated crops that are harvested for their stems. And most of these are sterile. You notice the first one on the list is vauke, the paper mulberry. This plant originates from the area of Taiwan and is moved all across the Pacific Islands by ancient Austronesian peoples. As this plant was moved, it was repeatedly selected for sterility. There's no reason to raise this plant for food, even though it does produce an edible fruit. Instead, people were raising it for bark, and in fact they preferred the bark of smaller stems. So the best way to get small stems is to grow lots of small trees, and they never quite get big enough to produce fruit. Therefore, over time and selection pressure, people changed this plant, selecting for varieties that grew well from cuttings, where you could just chop the tree into pieces, stick the pieces of the stem into the ground, and they would all grow. And this resulted in a lot of sterility. So the other plants on this list are also typically grown sterile. You notice sugarcane is here and bamboo is here. Both of these are most often planted from cuttings, although they do produce flowers now and then. The seed of these is not terribly important in the agricultural system. The next category we have is semi-domesticated root crops. And these tend to be fertile and don't have varieties that are recognized. This includes some of the aroids, such as Certosperma, which is a swamp taro, and a number of other kinds of root crops that are found in lowland areas. The next category is domesticated root crops. These include those that are largely sterile and have a number of varieties that are recognized. This includes the most important plant, kalo or taro. Other plants that fit this same category as being sterile domesticates with varieties are seen here. There's kind of two general categories that remain, which is plants that are used as gourd crops. All of these are in the family Cucurbitaceae. Notice that only one of these made it as far as Hawaii. This is the hue or ipu. We have three others that contribute to the breadth of diversity of Pacific Island agriculture. And then we finally have a category that's other kinds of fruit crops. This includes plants such as Job's tears, bananas, and popolo, and related species in the tomato family of the Solanaceae. The most important crop in the Pacific Islands is clearly kalo or taro, Colocasia esculenta. This is kind of the archetype of the family of plants, Araceae, or also known as aroids. Kalo has at least 300 and probably more than 350 varieties that were recognized in Hawaii alone in the past. In addition, hundreds of other varieties are found in other Pacific islands. In Hawaii, this was principally a crop of wetlands, and in fact this is one of the areas in which Hawaiians really excelled, was development of wetland agriculture. Now, kalo is grown in other parts of the Pacific in wetlands as well, so this is not a unique feature of Hawaii, but clearly Hawaiians probably had more land under taro agriculture than anybody else. Kalo is most noted for having calcium oxalate crystals in it, and these are often discussed as being the cause of the irritation, itchiness, or rash that can come if you either bite into raw plant material or eat it when it hasn't been cooked long enough. However, it turns out that the calcium oxalate crystals that are present are actually not the source of the irritation. These crystals are coated in a protein, and this protein is a digestive enzyme, which is pretty nasty, and therefore if you bite into raw taro and you basically are biting into a set of digestive enzymes that proceed to start to digest your skin. So it's actually the proteins that are the source of the problem. And when taro is steamed or boiled, the calcium oxalate crystals remain behind, but the proteins are denatured, therefore destroying their ability to be a problem. When we find a plant like taro that has lots and lots of varietal names, this is a clear indication that it's a plant that's really important to a society, because the presence of large numbers of varieties means that people have intensified the crop by growing lots of it and being observant of it and selecting out different types that could receive new names. All parts of kalo are eaten: the leaves, the petioles, and the underground rhizomes, often called a root or a corm. These are actually underground stems. This is a scene of a typical kind of lo'i in Hawaii, and here we see kalo being grown in a wet system. Now, kalo can also be grown in dryland agriculture, meaning it could be grown on a mountain slope or in another area where water is not flooded into it periodically. And in fact, there's varieties that are grown specifically this way that grow better in a dryland system than in a wet system. Even in a wet system, the plants are oftentimes rotated out so that every few plantings the individual stems will be grown in a dry system nearby in order to get rid of diseases that have accumulated on the stem. Kalo, or taro, is the archetype of the family Araceae. This family includes a large number of plants that are oftentimes confused with taro. Some of these plants are vines and are sometimes called tree taros, and some of these are upright and grow similar to taro. We also have a few related kinds of plants that get confused with these, and I'll cover that in a minute. So one of the first plants that gets confused with taro is Certosperma, or sometimes called swamp taro. You can see these men from the island of Rotuma are holding some pieces of a swamp taro corm. These three pieces are all actually chunks of the same plant. In order to harvest this, we had to dig down deep in the mud of a swamp and pull this all up. And this is roasted just the same as would a taro corm, but obviously you can feed a lot more people with one or two of these than you can with even the largest taro. Certosperma is found in swamps, sometimes ones that are partially inundated with salt water, but only swamps in truly tropical areas. And this plant doesn't grow that well in Hawaii because we're not truly tropical. The next plant that's quite common in Hawaii is a weedy invasive, and this is Xanthosoma. This plant is frequently confused with Ape, which is a Polynesian introduction to Hawaii. Xanthosoma and Ape are quite different. Xanthosoma is originally brought in from South America. It can be told apart from Alocasia, or what's oftentimes called elephant ear, which is true Ape, by looking at the flowers. The flower spikes on Xanthosoma will have flowers that go all the way to the end of the spike, whereas on Alocasia, at the tip of the spike, there will be a small section that does not include flowers, so it'll just be kind of a sterile tip at the end. So here we see a picture of Xanthosoma compared with Alocasia, or Ape. Another plant that is an aroid that sometimes becomes confused with taro is Caladium, oftentimes called angel's wings. This plant frequently has bright white or red spots on the leaves and looks for all the world like a spotted variety of taro. However, it isn't. This plant is actually more closely similar to the Xanthosoma, and in fact it has flowers that are quite similar to Xanthosoma in that they have the spike has flowers that go all the way to the tip of the inflorescence. Another plant that is sometimes confused with taro is Amorphophallus. Here you can see me standing next to a large Amorphophallus leaf. These plants are very unusual in that they put up just one leaf at a time. And this is the way to distinguish these, is that they only have one leaf exposed. The problem with this is that we have another plant that is completely unrelated to the aroids. It's actually more closely related to the yams, but it also puts up only one leaf each year, and it can easily be confused. This plant is Pia to Hawaiians and most other Polynesians. Taca leontopetaloides is the scientific name. And this plant, which has a leaf that looks for all the world similar to an Amorphophallus, is not an Amorphophallus and it is not an aroid. And in fact, to confuse these two could be quite dangerous, as Amorphophallus, which is an aroid, has calcium oxalate crystals in the tuber, whereas Pia, which is not an aroid, does not have those crystals. And so if you tried to produce the food product Pia out of an Amorphophallus, you'd be hating life for a little while after you ate it. The other agricultural commodity that's really important and is well worth discussing in relationship to Hawaii is uwala, which is the sweet potato. In Hawaii, the number of varieties of uwala was almost as much as the number of varieties as kalo, with some estimates of almost 300 varieties, although most people say in the low 200s. The origin of this plant is somewhat controversial. The most common theories indicate that it was domesticated in either southern Mexico or in the area of Peru, and then was subsequently taken out across the Pacific Islands. Other theories support the idea that it was domesticated in eastern Polynesia, probably in Tahiti or in the Marquesas, and yet other ideas propose that it's a domesticate from Asia. It's probably not a domesticate from Asia, and there's not a lot of solid evidence to support that it's a domesticate from Tahiti. However, the fact that it's distributed early on in the Polynesian migrations around eastern Polynesia is a good indicator that either it did come from Tahiti or it was picked up very early on from Polynesians visiting South America. One theory holds that it's evidence of Native Americans from South America traveling across the Pacific and encountering Polynesians. This seems highly unlikely, as there's many other crops they would have likely brought with them that did not make it. So this one crop is kind of an unusual one. In Hawaii, uwala was primarily a crop of drier lands. It certainly grows just fine in wetland areas, although not in swamps, but it grows very well in dry soils and wind-blown areas, and in many parts of the Hawaiian Islands where taro will not grow very well, uwala does quite nicely. The large number of varietal names is a clear indication of how important the plant was, and the fact that people were watching for new varieties to see if they might have some new characteristics that they could use to their advantage. All of the parts of the plant may be eaten, but the leaves and the roots are the most important parts, the leaves serving as a very important vegetable and source of vitamins and minerals. The Pacific Island crops that were developed long ago and brought across the ocean are all around us. If you look at a typical scene in Hawaii, you'll see many of these plants. Some of them appear to be ornamentals, some of them appear to be food plants, and many of them are just ignored, sitting there growing, doing their thing. Among these are a number of plants that appear to be Pacific Island crops but are actually not. They're actually from other parts of the world. And this is particularly true of the Araceae, that has many look-alike plants that are ornamentals. It's important when you think about these plants to realize that each of these was domesticated somewhere else and represents somebody else's agricultural history. And so what we see when we look across the mixed scene such as this is, although I focused on the Pacific Island crops and how they have come together, really our landscape includes the crop histories of lots of different cultures that have all come together because people who live in this one place have a keen interest in a diversity of plants.